Um, what I want to basically try and lay out is a framework for considering a really simple kind of worked example of where we are with all of this data stuff. And then from that worked example, I want us to have a little bit of a collective panic. And once we've had that panic, maybe we can start thinking about this stuff in a more kind of rationalist, reasonable way. One of the things that's going to be kind of present all the way through this talk is a discussion of algorithms and mechanisms of choice. So I just want to frame this first, and then as we go through it, will make a little more sense. So the way that we decide something individually or as a society, you could think of as a mechanism for choosing things. And mechanisms in economics are quite well understood. The most recent Nobel Prize for economics was specifically, or maybe it was one before that, was specifically on mechanism design. So an auction is a mechanism. If a government has a utility, a sort of shared asset, like the spectrum that our phones use for 4G communication, and they want to get a fair price for that thing, they design an auction with some rules, they put the thing up for auction, somebody buys it, and we have a kind of general social consensus that this represents a fair value for the thing that was sold, because anybody that wanted it could bid for it. Now, we all know that these mechanisms are extremely imperfect, they're prone to corruption, there's all kinds of trouble and mayhem that surrounds these things, but nonetheless that is a clear, simple example of a mechanism. Another mechanism of this kind is democracy. We choose, right, we have our social choice, where we decide that we're going to pick our leadership, one person, one vote, organized into political parties, represented usually by geographically bounded areas, and then those people count off against a register, and once that register passes 51%, you actually put something in charge of the bureaucracy with a prime minister and a cabinet and all the rest of this. And this is a mechanism. Once these mechanisms are established in society, we have a very strong tendency to then reify them. So we forget that democracy is one of a wide variety of systems of choice, and we automatically assume that democracy means 4-year electoral cycles, 5-year electoral cycles. So we begin to take a complex scope of possibilities and we wire it down to a single chosen mechanism that we then use interchangeably. So we forget that we made a decision to get here, and then afterwards we just naturally assume that democracy equals this. That is the mechanism. An auction is the only way of knowing what something is worth. A democracy is the only way of choosing a government. Does this generally make sense as a way of looking at the world? Mechanisms that we forget were mechanisms? Okay, then let us proceed. So, over the last some number of years, we've gone through revolution after revolution after revolution in data. I think that the first real revolution in data was this notion of simply having data. So there was a very early era in the 60s and 70s, magnetic tape, databases, all this kind of stuff. And that kind of bumbled along in the background. I think the next really big sudden shift was HFT, high frequency trading, when all of a sudden we began to hear about milliseconds and microseconds and extraordinarily rapid transformations of value in the financial system based on people trying to shave a few microseconds off the time that it took to get a signal from New York to Chicago and back. And there's an entire branch of the economy that extracts value from light speed delays. So, server racks close to the New York Stock Exchange in America are literally sold for millions of dollars per cubic meter, because you pack these things with machines and they can always get a trade in faster than a machine which is 200 meters down the road. Proximity equals speed, because we're right up against the hard physical limit. And a lot of people will argue that all of the value which is extracted by these systems is essentially stolen, because all they're doing is imposing friction on legitimate trade. So you want to buy some aluminium, you go to the market to buy some aluminium, 7 people buy or sell the aluminium before it reaches you, and none of them have ever seen an ounce of the stuff. So there are proposals like having a 10-minute delay on trading so that it would wipe out all of this HFT stuff. But until those kind of measures are taken, you simply have a friction in the system, which is a whole bunch of people using incredibly fast data to produce what I would regard probably as a distortion in the fundamental mechanisms that run the world. And we can argue about, free trade and whether or not people should be allowed to do things like that, but nonetheless, this is what's happening. The thing that we're doing next is, of course, big data. Does anybody have a definition of big data? Does anybody have an immediate, like, I know exactly what big data is? Yeah? How'd you?
The notion of not wanting to write in the models beforehand, but based on the patterns in the data.
That's actually a really good definition. The definition was deriving your models not from kind of thinking about things beforehand, but from observing patterns in the data. So if you go down that path, big data is kind of like statistical learning, and in some ways it's almost like a branch of AI. Like Google's translation service is almost entirely driven by vast quantities of translated text being statistically correlated. So it doesn't have a theory of language, which is what you always assumed machine translation would have, that machine translation and understanding of language would be closely correlated. Instead, it's what Searles would have called a Chinese room. It's a big machine that has absolutely no understanding what it's doing, and it just mashes symbols according to rules, but nonetheless it translates very well. I often think of big data in terms of how much data does it have to be before it's big? Is it gigabytes? Is it petabytes? Is it so much data that only a dozen organizations in the world can afford to store it? And I think that if you kind of think of it as being big data is data which is so big that only a few organizations have the muscle to actually work with this stuff, that produces quite an interesting way of viewing big data. If you think of it as being the data which requires supercomputers to manage and tens of billions of dollars a year of data management budget, I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about it. Out of big data comes a whole different approach, this kind of evidence-based modeling, and lots and lots and lots of people are very enthusiastic that this big data thing is going to result in something worthwhile at the end of the day. And I think we could point to lots and lots and lots of incremental gains that have come from it, but it's still kind of sitting out there as something that other people do, largely because of the sheer cost and expense of working with this stuff. Right? It's still fundamentally an elite thing, in the same way that HFT was an elite thing, because to play that game you needed to be slapped directly on top of a supercomputer, directly on top of a fiber optic pipe, preferably with a supercomputer. So now we get down to this immutable data thing. Another fashion in data, this time for data. I thought that was my phone for a minute. So this immutable data thing is extremely problematic, because anybody can play the game, but nobody really understands what they're doing, because it's actually super, super, super complicated, but all the complexity is hidden. So the simplest way for an ordinary person to go out there and scorch their fingers a little bit with immutable data is you go to the internet, you find a Bitcoin wallet site, you get yourself a Bitcoin wallet, you find somebody that has some Bitcoin, you hand them 20 euros in cash and they send you some Bitcoin. And you've now done a transaction which will be stored on some invisible magic book for, in theory, the next X centuries. It'll be stored there until people no longer regard Bitcoin as being of even historical interest. And given the current rate of transformation that Bitcoin is pushing on the world, I think that could be quite a while. So what I want people to kind of think about is how simple that access to immutable data is relative to the access to fast data or big data. Right? You could say that Google Search or Google Translate are examples of routine casual access to big data, but these are things where you can use the systems, but very little of what you do is recorded, stored, bound, part of the process. You become a consumer of those services, but you're in no way, shape, or form an actor. Whereas if you start using something like Bitcoin, you're an actor in these processes. You're actually doing the thing that produces the change in the system. You're interacting with a machine, which is going to store the data essentially forever. Where forever means probably 40 years. But so the accessibility of these technologies is really new. And they're going to continue to get easier and easier and easier to use, and more and more and more accessible. I would guess back of the envelope that it'll be somewhere between 3 and 5 years before every shiny new Apple computer has some kind of blockchain-based something on it. It might be for data storage, it might be for password management, it might be for backing up your files. But the notion that you'll just have, casual access to blockchain technology and consumer products, I think that's going to come very quickly. And blockchains are just ways of making relatively small data sets today, but much bigger data sets later, completely permanent, because there are tens of thousands of copies all over the world. It's not really rocket science, and I'll talk a little bit more about how they work later, but this notion that it's just a massively replicated thing with some very, very sophisticated tamper resistance, so you can't just edit it in one place and have the false change propagate over the network. It's a simple, simple way of thinking about these things. Now, that notion that you have a generation shift in data, that process is not going to stop with immutable data. In the same way that fast and big kind of solve different problems, fast and big and immutable solve different problems. There's always going to be a certain amount of bleed through where these things kind of hybridize and combine, but I guarantee that tomorrow there'll be another kind of new data that suddenly is out all over the place and is extremely fashionable. Internet of Things, I think, is a pretty good candidate for this kind of pervasive computing. Everything you go, the doors open and register when they're open and closed. The core systems of the society begin to be part of this woven responsive web. And so don't think of this stuff as being in any way a terminal point. It's simply a rolling forward of fashion in technology, in the same way that you see a rolling forward of, say, fashion in camping gear or in bicycle design. These things are all driven by kind of core social processes that just roll onward over time. Okay, next slide, please. There we go. Right. So I want to take this as an example of a part of life which has been heavily transformed by data and the access to data in ways that really nobody is entirely comfortable thinking about, right? And, I've roughed this number in at 10%. I've read various numbers from 7 up to about 15. You pick your source and you take your choice, but nobody can deny that internet dating has become a huge part of how people meet each other, and meeting each other still turns out to be a critical part of people having babies. So we're in this kind of crossing point where, the data thing is beginning to really substantially impact people's personal lives in ways that everybody is a little shy to discuss, but actually it's become quite pervasive. And I want you to think about if we were having this talk, around the time that, our good friend Norbert gave his talk. Imagine what he would have said if he'd known that in the future 10% of human beings would be created by matches that were made by a computer. Right? Can you imagine the anxiety that would have provoked our forebears? Right? Our forebears would have been astonishingly nervous. Oh my God, how will the machines choose who should be with who? Over a few generations, won't that steer the entire human race in completely unthinkable directions? Right? But, how will you make the machines decide how to match people? Now, remember I was talking before about mechanism design, right? So an internet dating service is a mechanism which has many effects, but one of them is making new human beings according to a set of matching criteria that are embodied inside of what amounts to an economic engine, an economic game. So the humans that are matched by an internet dating site are the humans that it is most profitable for the internet dating site to match. Does that seem like a reasonable set of criteria for making 10% of humans? What do you think? Yeah, it makes me a little nervous too. So I want to break that down a little further. I have a theory here, which I have no data to back up. This is pure hypothesis, but I just have this theory that maybe internet dating sites deliberately match people in relationships that won't last because then they'll come back to the internet dating site. Right? Because if you've got access to all of this statistical information about user behavior, right, these two people hooked up, went on 2 dates and dropped off the site entirely is probably a decent indicator that they are now, in a relationship and are no longer, crawling across the web looking for replacements. At which point they've ceased to put any value back into the system. Right? In the same way that we've got designed obsolescence in washing machines or cars, where the mechanisms are made to break down in a few years because it's more profitable to replace them than to keep fixing them indefinitely. Right? You have to spend a lot of money to get a washing machine which is not designed to break down. So it seems entirely reasonable to me that internet dating systems may well be deliberately setting up unstable relationships on the basis that these are simply more profitable in the long run. And I think it's pretty easy to imagine that if you were in charge of an internet dating site, the fact that you're losing customers to successful relationships would be an obvious drain on your bottom line. Now, I can't imagine that anybody's going to get caught doing this anytime soon, but if somebody was to hack one of these services and discover that this is how it worked internally, would any of us really be surprised? Right? I mean, this is the logic of capitalism applied at a biopolitical level. If you're going to be making your matches through the internet by companies that have a business model driven by targeted advertising and subscription fees, you can't really be all that surprised when they choose to set up matches which might not be for your interest but are fundamentally for their interest. And if this is a mechanism that's leading to 10% of the human race being born in the countries that are heavily using internet dating, we shouldn't be surprised if things get a little weird after a couple of generations. Right? I just want to give us a moment to sort of pause and breathe and have a think about that. I mean, am I describing the world that we currently live in? Is there any doubt that this is plausible? Right. So at that point, I think we have to then kind of pause for breath and just look at that for a moment. The people are being selected by agencies which have no particular interest in fomenting stable relationships. They may or may not do it by accident, but it's certainly against their business interest if they're too good at it. And that set of business mechanisms is directly affecting the genetic makeup of the human race in quite a substantial way, given the number of people that are meeting through these systems. So you can imagine, and I'm going to push this a little further, that the kind of era of, say, OkCupid, which was the dominant life form in that ecology for a while, right? At least for people that designed websites for a living and wore like thick glasses. The generation of, kind of OkCupid matches, there was a lot of emphasis on writing your profile and a particular kind of ability to occupy a fashion niche and all the rest of this stuff, right? Then along comes Tinder, which is a system which doesn't show any text when it makes the initial match. And people will just sit there based on geography and location, geography and timing. It will show essentially a real-time feed of people in the area that might be interested in connecting. So people go to places where they think there'll be a lot of interesting people, sit around in corners of bars and sit there compulsively swiping right or left, basically scanning the area for people that they might match with, right? This will definitely produce a different set of matches than people sitting at home on their desktop PCs reading the text that was written by people on a website. There's no doubt at all that a different mechanism for making introductions will result in different matches, and if some percentage of Tinder dates turn into relationships which turn into kids, then you'll have different human beings coming into existence because of a different algorithm on a different website, a different app, that had a different model for matching people. A different mechanism results in different human beings. And it seems very likely indeed that this kind of process is going to continue further in time as these systems get better and better and better at giving people what they want, not necessarily what they need. You're going to see an increasing transformation in dating culture with more and more and more human beings that come out of algorithms. How uncomfortable is this? Right? It's positively skin-crawling for me right now, actually laying the argument down in public. You get this kind of like, well, that can't possibly be right. It feels almost superstitious, but there's definitely a sense of like, should we really be delegating that to machines? But then you've got to say, well, if we go back to the pre-machine age, what did we delegate it to? Geographical proximity and the available quantity of alcohol. Right? More or less. Right? I mean, for example, how much do you think the birth rate in Scandinavia would drop in the event that they had a complete alcohol moratorium that was actually effective? Right? If there was some, genetically engineered flu, and after you caught the flu, you could no longer metabolize alcohol properly, how long would it take Scandinavian culture to adapt again to the point where people could form new relationships rather than sitting there frostily staring at each other? Right? I've lived in Iceland. There hasn't been an Icelander conceived sober in about 700 years. No offense to my Icelandic friends. It was them that told me this. So, it's not as if we didn't have mechanisms for doing this stuff before, which are just as crazy and unnatural as the idea of putting a computer into the mix, right? The evolution of alcohol, we didn't evolve with alcohol. We probably invented brewing on some kind of industrial scale 10,000 years ago. There's a pretty decent argument that it's one of the things that forced us to settle down and farm. Agricultural surplus plus pottery equaled beer. No, really, like archaeological perspective, right? People really think about this. So, we already made one radical shift in the way that the human race hooks up, which is we introduced alcohol, right? And the cultures that were heavily dependent on alcohol as a way of doing business were very different from the cultures that were very much about things like arranged marriage, right? On one side of my family are European, the other branch are Indian, and back through their genetic history, they had completely different mechanisms for selecting in each generation who would wind up with who, right? Even the cousins in my generation had arranged marriages and were about as happy as anybody was with their marriage. It wasn't, even now it's not clear that on statistical data arranged marriages are on average less successful and less happy than the so-called love match, right? So there are clearly lots of options in the mechanisms that we use to make these kinds of things happen in our societies. Whether one mechanism works less well than another one, that can be argued, but the idea that there is a natural system and an unnatural system, I think to find out anything resembling a natural system, you'd have to go back pre-agriculture. And at that point, we're basically speculating. We've no real idea about what human beings were up to in those days. We have some guesses. We know that there's about a 200,000 to maybe 400,000 year gap between the invention of fire and the invention of agriculture. So we've got an awful lot of time sitting around campfires, telling stories or whatever it was we did to pass the time before we get to the farming part. So long gaps. Yes?
Would you consider algorithmic marriage a variant of arranged marriage?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'm going to get to those kind of questions in a moment, because I'm going to ask what happens when the state gets involved. So the fact that we've got, generation after generation of these mechanisms which are all artificial until we get to a state in nature where all we know is that we had fire but no agriculture and we spent a lot of time around campfires. By the way, just while we're chasing that particular thread down, does it not seem like what most people consider to be the peak experiences of their lives are small groups of young people around campfires in natural conditions? Like if you let teenagers off the loose, kind of out on the loose, typically what they will do is grab a car, head for nature, put up some tents and make a big fire. So I think this notion is that we might be recreating the circumstances of our earlier evolution over and over and over again as close as we can get to them, in the same way that dogs like to hunt, even if they happen to live in perfectly nice suburban areas, they still chase rabbits. Human beings like fire and they like the outdoors. And this is particularly visible in America, where they've got large, rugged wilderness areas which really were quite Paleolithic in their way. They're not that different from what we'd have seen state in nature. The drag that people feel to go out into these places and have experiences which are something like what their ancestors would have had is palpable. It's a really strong effect. Just checking how we're doing for time. Right. So, could I have the next slide, please? So, the scenario that I've been discussing is what happens when companies use data to match human beings. And we've talked about the incentives, which are a bit strange for a company, the possible risk that they might be deliberately setting up temporary matches, all these kind of things. Let's now re-narrate this in a situation where, for example, the state got right on top of this. Has anybody heard of a book called Red Plenty? So Red Plenty is a book that basically examines from a kind of science fiction but also from an economics perspective what would have happened if the Soviet Union had gotten its act together to actually deliver the promise of industrial socialism. If they just sorted their stuff out a little better in the 1950s, it's possible that they could have produced an extremely high standard of living on a substantially different set of drivers than the ones that were being deployed in America, but with a similar quality of life output. And it goes through a kind of history of where the mistakes were made and how it could have been done in other ways. Expect in about 20 years another round of kind of socialist thinking to emerge as it becomes possible to use quantum computers to solve the scheduling problem in a way which is demonstrably more efficient than what you can generate with a free market. The reason, and this is kind of for technical people in the audience, the reason that that matters is that you can't solve the scheduling problem because the scheduling problem is NP complete or NP hard. But if you have a computer, you can solve the NP hard problem in, I don't know, polynomial time or something like that, which makes it possible to run a planned economy efficiently. So once you can solve the traveling salesman problem, you can solve everything, and the prospect is that you could basically outperform capitalism, take the same data set, crunch the results, show you would have gotten 20% more industrial throughput if you'd done it properly. So the notion that socialism is gone forever, I think it's simply a pendulum swing from local to global optimization as a way of climbing the hills. Right, technical section ends. So, just have to get this stuff in there, somebody will want to know. So what if we imagine a situation in which the Russians got through the industrial crisis, automated, put in cybernetic systems, and wound up with gigantic quantities of personal data on all of their citizens as a result, in a similar manner to the US National Security Agency. All of the communications are tapped, all of the purchasing decisions are on a credit card, the credit card goes directly to the Kremlin, and they bash all the data with an enormous hammer. Right? Now, it's clear that an enormous cause of misery and unhappiness in your society is people in unsuccessful relationships. You know from the data that when people break up, the alcoholism rate doubles, or whatever it would have been for the Soviets, triples. And as a result, it's really good if you can avoid these messy breakups because they're bad for your industrial production, they're demonstrably bad for the economy. You go through and you calculate an economic cost to each broken marriage, and then you factor this into the industrial planning, and eventually somebody says, well, why don't we just make marriages that don't break? And you send out some scientists, and they do some research, and they look at the data, and you come up with a state marriage bureau, right? And don't laugh, it's no more ridiculous than leaving this up to a company, is it? You leave it to industrial capitalism without even blinking an eyeball, but the idea the state would do it seems ridiculous. Remember what I said about reifying a model? You take the model that you currently work with as a mechanism, and then you assume that that's just how reality is, and that's the natural state of human beings. That is exactly what it is like. So you go to the State Marriage Bureau, and they take all of the information they have in your profile, and everything that they know, and they crunch it through a set of mysterious algorithms, and they introduce you to a series of potential partners under a set of circumstances which are optimally designed to produce the best likelihood of a good match. Right? What if it worked? Right? What if it was actually a really good way for people to find partners? You could take your chances with meeting some random stranger, but if it didn't happen in a few years, you get to your late 20s, early 30s, you think, maybe I'm going to try the State Marriage Bureau, and they hook you up with somebody and it works. And what if this was common enough as a good way of doing things, and it was successful enough and the averages were good enough, that people did it preferentially over wandering around in bars drunk, in the same way that in this culture they preferentially go to internet dating rather than wandering around in bars drunk. Huh? Now, what are the incentives for a state if it's going to be arranging marriages? Right? If the incentive for an internet dating service is temporary matches so you continue to use the service, the incentive for the state is probably permanent, durable relationships which reduce social costs. Which one would we prefer if we were going to be choosing what we get out of a service that was going to find us partners? Maybe when we're young, we want the system which produces relatively random things which don't last all that long but are really interesting and exciting. Maybe when we're older, we want something that produces permanent matches. But capitalism cannot likely generate a system that gives us permanent matches because we don't incentivize the systems in the correct way. And so the capitalist use of data will tend to produce junk food, and this kind of fantasy socialist use of data will tend to produce marriages which are good for the interests of the state. We fantasize that this might be marriages which are permanent. It might be marriages where people are miserable at home and are really productive at work. Right? As long as it doesn't drive them to drinks. You need an optimal level of unhappiness at home to make sure that people are productive but not drunken. You can never tell what the big data will show turns out to be the optimum incentive structure for the person who's doing the job. Yeah, it's not a very comfortable way of looking at the world. It took me a long time to work up to this. So, other situations that you can imagine pertaining. Suppose we had an enormous set of data on relationship success. right? So people would basically publish tons and tons and tons of anonymized data about their relationship histories, and all of this stuff would slosh around in a bucket, and you could then take your prospective partner, whack them through the big data analysis thing that you yourself were performing, maybe with some open source tools, and it would be incentivized to find exactly the people that you wanted for exactly the kind of relationships that you felt like. You can imagine a kind of fantasy Wikipedia which just has, 250,000 well-documented relationships in it, matching criteria, personality profiles, whatever data people felt like publishing. And this is not so crazy. There's quite a lot of discussion about mass publication of human genomes from people that are willing to sacrifice their privacy for progress. And there could be really interesting results if we had an enormous number of people publishing their genome data publicly. They take the hit on privacy, but we suddenly get much better chance of analysing certain classes of diseases, and goodness knows what else we might learn about human biology and psychology. So it's not crazy to think that people might do this. It might look crazy for this generation, but does anybody remember what culture was like before Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey? Right? I mean, these things would have been considered enormously disgusting heresies in the 1980s or 1990s, and you finally get to a point where every generation has to find something to appall prior generations, and that was basically all that was left. God only knows where they're going next. What do you feed to your parents to drive your parents nuts if 50 Shades of Grey was what your parents were into? Right? This constant drive of the young to appall the old is one of the few things that you can really count on in culture. And particularly as somebody in their mid-40s, I really get to look at culture like, my God, these kids are crazy. And that tells you that you're aging. So what if, right, we had this large-scale publication of relationship histories that people could then use to optimize their relationships? This would be a data commons. So while an individual might be doing the analysis, they'd be pulling from a commons or a cooperative that would actually manage all of this as stored data. And that's quite interesting because you could almost certainly get the system of incentives right at the analysis level, because you could commission people to build tools like open source software that would be used to perform the analysis on the public data set. And in all probability, people wouldn't be incentivized to lie when they publish into the public data set because it would be anonymous. So it's entirely possible that you could construct a system which was incentivized to do what was good for you rather than what was good for the state or what was good for capitalism. Right? Industrial production motive, profit motive, however you want to think about these motives, there are definitely situations in which the data is being used in ways which only partially serve your interests unless you're the person in control of the data set. But the tension that we're always going to find is if the only data set that I have access to is my own experience, I don't have any benefit from a kind of wider cultural learning. And there are basically two approaches to that. The first is mass assembly of common data. So Wikipedia is a good example of this. Everybody pulls their data into a commons, and the output of that commons is vastly more better organized human knowledge than you were going to have access to otherwise. And this is a really good, really successful attempt. And that might be quite an interesting experiment, where you could basically have something which is kind of like what they call VRM, vendor relationship management, where people could publish their profiles and their psychometrics anonymously and then use cryptography to allow people to contact them but without revealing their identities. And you can imagine all kinds of interesting things would happen in that scenario. It's the kind of thing that you could, in theory, build on the Ethereum blockchain relatively easily. And you could get the agency lined up between the people with the data and the people who wanted the services. But to do it, you need individuals to be acting in their own best interest together without having a middleman or a state which is basically distorting the situation for their own benefit. And I think as an experiment, this is quite interesting because it really shows how deeply the data thing touches our lives. We're all in a culture where the people around us are using computers to find not just shoes, but men and women. The most intimate areas of our lives, we voluntarily turn over to the machines because we think they can do a better job than we can do on our own. In the same way that we've turned over the quest for a perfect hamburger from our kitchen to our restaurants. Right? And we just do these things because the culture around us encourages them and naturalizes them and normalizes them. We bring in a counterfactual from an imaginary culture, and it seems shocking and horrifying. My God, the State Marriage Bureau, that's insane, right? But when you put it beside OkCupid or Tinder, why is one madder than the other? And then finally, we look at how much work it would be to have self-determination in these areas. The labor that we would have to put in to build the software and potentially the hardware to operate a kind of human matching service that wasn't driven by either capitalism or state interest seems like an enormous amount of work. But if it produced a result that was as good as Wikipedia, it might be far better than the deal that we could get from either the previous artificial system, which was alcohol and bars, let us note also capitalist interest in provision of both of these services, right? Or the matching systems which served social stability at a tribal level. You know, the Indian arranged marriage system, yeah, it was about making sure that your kids were happy, but it was also about making sure that you could stand your kid's future wife or husband, right? The parents were not selecting these kids solely because it was going to make their kid happy. They were also picking people that they could live with because, you know, that was going to be the mother of your grandchildren. You were going to make damn sure that you picked somebody that you liked and got along with. So the ability for human beings to express their interests cleanly and clearly without being pulled by their service providers or their culture is something that I think is a relatively new invention. The market does a poor job of that, but it does a better job than most of the previous systems have done. The commons approach that you see with things like Wikipedia, I think, is another step forward. Probably in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, it will be visible as imperfect in different ways. Particularly, I'd point to the bureaucratization of Wikipedia. But if we think that it might be possible to have large-scale cooperative behavior where individuals seek their self-interest together without market mechanisms through cooperative sharing of data, I think something extremely interesting might come out of that. I picked the example of dating because it's something that really hits people hard, and it really brings up huge questions about the legitimacy of things like market mechanisms. But for buying and selling houses, for renting houses, for car rides, for all these kinds of things, if you have a capitalist agency in the middle or a state agency in the middle, they will operate these systems in ways which will benefit them and it benefit you perhaps incidentally, right? If we move into a position where we've got a much more fundamental grip on reality and we are working with these systems in ways that are directly about our own needs, but we do it together, we could produce much, much cleaner running systems. There's a thing running in London called Open Rent, which is a website which basically has a fixed fee structure for finding you a house. And it's very, very transparent. It's very fair. It's not as huge as it might be, but it's an example of people trying to build systems that are as close to an open system as possible. So I think what we might see in the future is systems which have all the strength of big data systems. They've got the real kind of industrial grunt power of big data. But they're made from lots and lots and lots of small data published under open licenses and then synthesized together using the kind of algorithms that we currently use in big data. And those kind of systems, if they're correctly licensed, could provide a very effective hedge against the growth of corporate and state power, because you might simply ban for-profit use of that data. Or you might require that any institution that uses that data in a for-profit way also publishes every single byte that it owns that isn't somebody else's personal data as public data. There might be all kinds of interesting ways of policing, managing, regulating these data commons in such a way that you get high quality services of the kind that you're used to getting from capitalism, but without the 7% shaving that capitalism will typically give you for making a match, and without the weird incentives like dating sites that want you to break up with somebody. I think that's the last slide, isn't it? Was there one more? Oh, right. Sorry, there was one more. So the other thing that I want to talk about is technology horizons. And basically, right now, all of these four technologies are currently going completely bananas. My first paying gig, the first thing that I ever made money doing when I was a kid, was I did a review of a virtual reality system for a magazine called Computer Shopper in 1991 when I was 19. And it was amazing. It was this thing, it was a big kind of plastic arcade machine about the size of this table that you sat in, and you put on a helmet that was on an arm, and the helmet weighed like, I don't know, 10 kilos or something. It was crazy. But sure enough, you could put the helmet on and you could look around, and there were weird kind of flapping polygon reptiles that you could shoot with a gun. And it barely worked, but it didn't really need to do much more than barely work. It was stunning. I went through the 1990s shaping my career around the idea that VR was right around the corner. I went off and learned the right kind of graphics, the right kind of databases, the right kind of this, that, and the next thing. And it didn't come and didn't come and didn't come and didn't come. And then I went off into energy policy and disaster relief and worked on, humanitarian systems design and refugee sheltering and all the rest of this stuff, infrastructure theory, simple critical infrastructure maps, and it didn't come and didn't come and didn't come and didn't come. And finally, Q1 of 2016, there are going to be about 5 competing VR systems from big companies like Facebook and Sony. I think they were all aiming for Christmas and they all missed, but whatever it happens to be, Q1 2016 is going to be consumer VR will finally have landed. My guess is that Christmas 2017 is going to be the Christmas of virtual reality. Right? Craziness. Does anybody have any idea how weird it's going to get when you take the current culture that we have and then give it virtual reality? Right? I mean, it's like feeding, like Mountain Dew or, sort of triple strength Coca-Cola to small children, right? We're just going to caffeinate the entirety of primary school and wait and see what happens. Blockchains, we've talked a bit about blockchains. You've all heard of a lot of people talking about blockchains. They're fantastic technologies for having larger groups of people take collective action. The technical details of how they work, you could watch any one of my talks that I've done in the last 3 months on YouTube. I'll explain it. I'm not going to go over it again. You don't need to know. Weak AI, right? So did anybody see these kind of weird dog lizards things that came out of Google a while ago? Google Deep Dream, right? So we now have AI systems which are good enough to take a picture and name just about every object in the picture. This is a red table, that's a glass of water, that's a microphone stand, that's a weird yellow cube, why is it here? And these systems work by basically doing very simple simulations of the brain, or at least very simple simulations of a 1970s understanding of the brain with enormous amounts of computer power behind them. All the way through my youth, I used to say, right, fundamentally, we don't have a computer which is artificially intelligent. Don't even worry about it. They can't tell the difference between a picture of a cat and a picture of a dog. Well, now they can. You should start worrying. Right? It's a simple litmus test. Can it function in the real world? Yes. And they're only going to get better and they're only going to get faster. I don't think we're going to wind up with human-like intelligence. I'm not sure that we're going to wind up with a computer that can hold up a conversation anytime soon. But I think we're going to get computers that can solve problems that previously required human intelligence on a mass scale within 5 or 10 years. Like checking homework for, students done by machines. Entirely credible. Medical diagnosis, career advice, house shopping, all that machines. Very plausible. Robots, Internet of Things, and drones. I kind of bundle those together because they're all basically about taking stuff out of software and sticking it in the real world. The drone, Apple's drone phone, big propellers, you kind of throw it in the air, it hovers there, it takes some selfies, it runs out of battery in about 30 seconds. But it will get you a selfie that you've got no other way of getting. There's a product for professional sports people, the name of which has just slipped out of my mind, but it's a drone that you basically throw into the air and it follows you around as you're doing your snowboarding or whatever the heck else is that you're doing, and it takes pictures of you as you go. And they're good enough that a lot of professionals are using these things. Absolutely amazing. And then, all these technologies hybridize. They interconnect, they fuse, they crosswire. You have a series of drones that are negotiating a landing place. They have an auction on a blockchain to figure out what order they're going to land in. Then they all go and countersign each other's flight paths. Then if one of them crashes into other when they land, they automatically assign liability and the insurance pays out on a blockchain. And if you need to real-time monitor what's actually happening, you can plug into any one of the drones through a virtual reality system and you can watch the thing landing and it'll show you the flight paths that it's bought and sold with the other drones. 5 years. It's probably in the lab today. I haven't figured out exactly who's doing it, but I bet anybody who looks at this space will see roughly that solution to that problem. Same thing for self-driving cars when they come to junctions. So we're at the beginning of this rolling, boiling, pervasive shift in the underlying technology that society is running on. I think you're going to see an enormous amount of that is mediated through phones, particularly when you slap them onto your face and wear them as virtual reality systems, which is going to become ubiquitous because they have cameras mounted on them, so you could look through the phone and you could just walk around in virtual reality. That's going to become common within 5 years, probably. Certainly the technical capability to do it will become common. Whether people adopt it or not will be a matter of fashion, right? But a world in which some people are walking around in the world with all the garbage edited out is coming very quickly. Noise cancelling headphones, anybody use them? Right? I'm a big fan of noise cancelling headphones. There's a brand called Digital Silence, which costs about $20. It's a really cheap way of experimenting with augmented reality because you play music through them when you're on a train and it takes away all of the background hiss and rumble. It basically makes British engineering sound like Swiss engineering. Right? And if you wear them on planes, all of the background noise goes away from the plane because the plane's engineering is basically perfect. So the noise signature is very reliable and it pulls the noise out quite quickly. So heavy-duty noise-cancelling headphones are quite expensive. They're 200, 300 euros. You don't know whether you like it until you try it. But try the cheap stuff and just get a sense of what it's like to live in an electronically mediated reality. I quite often get out of the tube still wearing them and walk through downtown London without realising that I'm wearing them. And the whole thing has this kind of serene, dreamlike quality because most of the traffic noise is gone. And I don't realise until I've been going for a while that I'm walking through London with no awareness of the traffic, right? Because I can't really hear it, so it's just faded out, and I'm walking through a kind of a Wim Wenders film. Wenders, well, anyway. Right? So all of this stuff is coming. It's coming really quickly. The political structures that we deploy to wrangle these technologies are completely up to us. Open source software, I think, and I hope, is a huge part of this future. And as we move forward into this kind of space, all I can say is, just watch out for the young people. They're going to do impossibly weird things, and they're going to scare the crap out of us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vinay. There is some time for questions, but before I open it up to the audience, I have one for you, actually. Because it seems that let's go back to the case of dating. You're sort of advocating these open, distributed systems between people to arrange all of that. But as soon as someone will find a technology to make it a little bit more easy for someone to get someone else in that system, it will be capitalized and it will be sold. So my question basically is, how do you keep capitalism out of such a system?
So Wikipedia managed it with licensing. So the Wikipedia license says that if you use this technology, if you use the data in Wikipedia, you have to make the data that you're going to put with it free also. So if I edit a Wikipedia article to clean it up and then I publish it in a written form, all the changes that I made have to go back into Wikipedia. So that's one side of it. Also, Wikipedia changes and grows and evolves so rapidly that every time people try and make a copy of Wikipedia that works in some different way, usually it falls behind the main branch so quickly that it just evaporates. But yeah, licensing is absolutely key. It's the defensive line because it's basically, it takes the defensive structures of capitalism, so typically copyright, and it inverts them to protect the commons. And this was Richard Stallman's genius when he came up with the copyleft system. He realized that you could implement a kind of, communitarian sharing commons on top of capitalist property rights protection. And this is a legendary piece of genius. I think that Stallman, how many people in the room actually know Richard Stallman's name? Oh, that's shocking. So 500 years from now, Stallman will be remembered and Gandhi will be forgotten. He's that important, right? The only reason that we know anything about the technology that runs our society is because Stallman changed the way that we write software so that the source code was open and shared, and the Stallman architecture for creating software runs 70% of the world's mobile phones. Right? It runs Linux, it runs most of the machines that run the internet. Stallman is the Gandhi that worked.
But yeah,
I'm being serious, right? I'm being deadly serious. What Gandhi left India was a bunch of people with nuclear weapons staring at us over their Qurans. India's in terrifying danger because we didn't correctly resolve the situation between Hindus and Muslims there. Right?
Does Stalin have a biography yet?
I'm not sure if there is a biography of Stallman, right? He's very autistic and he's very difficult, but the accuracy with which his political theories can be implemented to produce the change that you want to see in the world is much higher than of any other current existing political thinker. It's way better than Marx, it's way better than Gandhi. It really delivers, and almost nobody's ever heard of him because he's autistic and difficult. People discount the value of his work because socially he's extremely awkward. And this really needs to be a lesson that people take in, right? Get Stallman. Really read his stuff. Understand what he had to say. Typically, there's a lag of 20 years between Stallman says it and everybody turns around and says, oh God, he was right again. Freedom to read. Read freedom to read and then look at the Kindle.
Okay. But why I was asking that question is now because one of the criticism that blockchain technology is currently receiving is that sort of these market platforms are sort of squeezing their way in and charging fees for any transactions.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, what we're attempting to do is get as many big institutions onto blockchains as possible, because blockchains are automatically transparent. So at least at the current level of technology development, if it happened on a blockchain, the entire world could know. So if you think that society lacks transparency, getting these guys onto blockchains is a good idea. And having capitalist systems running on top of blockchains at least gives you a transparent capitalism.
And is that something we want?
It's certainly progress, right? I mean, I would rather have a transparent capitalism than a non-transparent capitalism. Whether you can then reduce the influence of markets in your society, I think that's a personal choice thing. Right? Part of the reason that we have societies which are dominated by markets is because IKEA is fantastic, right? We're in a position where we actually like most of what capitalism does, which is why we won't organize mass resistance to it. And until we come up with a better system than capitalism, we won't be able to displace it. So I think we have to kind of admit that we're locked into a relationship with capitalism because we are consumers. And if we want to replace it, we need to design the upgrade and move to the upgrade rather than thinking that we can somehow force capitalism back out because socialism was so fantastic in the Soviet era, right? We need a vision of what the future looks like. If we want to get rid of the present, we need a new future.
Okay. There's also some voices that claim that transparency is not always good, right? So maybe I can come up with some cases that even in current day capitalism where we actually should cherish some closed offness from our point of view.
Yes, absolutely, right? So how we protect privacy in a blockchain world is the next big shift, right? And right now, I'm about 8,500, 9,000 words into a very long essay about identity in blockchains, which is basically about this question of, Bitcoin protected your identity because you were anonymous. You could tell how much money was in the account, but you could never figure out who the account belonged to. As soon as you begin to introduce any kind of identity into a blockchain environment, then you wind up with this kind of participatory panopticon problem where everybody knows exactly who you are all the time. And if we don't want that, we're going to have to deploy more cryptography, and pretty soon we're beginning to talk about kind of real cypherpunk technology.
So we're going to have a Swiss part in the blockchain. That's not going
coming to a world near you very soon.
Let's open it to the audience. Are there any questions out there?
What do you think about this?
For the people in the back, because we don't have an audience mic, the question here is, was dating such a great example? Because dating sort of teases out bad data because people will obviously cheat on those forms.
Well, so yeah, this is a great question about incentives. I don't know how much of the data on dating sites is lies. I don't know whether anybody's done the study where they've gone out and actually correlated it with reality. If anybody knows, I'd be very interested in that. But yeah, I mean, there's no doubt at all that if you created a system that had accurate incentives, there'd be less of a tendency to lie to try and trick the algorithms, but people might still lie to trick other people. And I don't think that's different whether somebody tells you that they're a brain surgeon in a bar or whether somebody is filling out a form and telling you they're a brain surgeon. The problem is that human beings will always find ways of gaming systems. On the other hand, the precise mechanisms by which people choose to game the systems also have signatures. So we might discover that, if we had a big open data set, we might discover that 99.9% of the people that tell you that they're brain surgeons are lying. So you can simply stop telling people that you're a brain surgeon if you are a brain surgeon, and if you're not, you could just take all the brain surgeons and chuck them, right? So, their kind of game and counter game will continue to exist because the nature of evolutionary systems is this very kind of, close-up struggle. And I think that will continue to be the case, unfortunately or fortunately, until we start matching people by their genetics. Right? You take a gene sequence, you take another gene sequence, you've crunched enough of the data to know that these genes are attracted to those genes, and then you match people genetically, and it's all perfectly scientific. Well, we're not sure of that, actually. Oh, but the smell, right? Now that we've gotten to that. So, the smell thing comes from a set of genes called the major histocompatibility complex, MHC. And it turns out that most of what we're attracted to in other people's smell is the configuration of their immune system, and there's a direct correlation between the immune system genes and the way that people smell. So it turns out that when people are taking the birth control pill, it changes the pattern of genes that they find attractive, and it changes the smell of people that they're attractive to. So there's a hypothesis that when American couples or European couples, cultures that are on the pill when they're dating, get together, they're perfectly comfortable together, the woman goes off the pill because she wants to have kids, and at that point the partner begins to smell wrong and the relationship breaks down. So there's the possibility that in a few years, once the genetic stuff has gotten properly resolved, like once we've gone from early studies to mature studies, you're going to see the biggest class action suit in the world as everybody that got divorced in America in the past 30 years goes after the birth control companies. Yeah, search term is major histocompatibility complex. I'm not making this up, although I am slightly glossing the technical detail.
Let's make sure that in our dating union that we're going to form, we also take up the issues.
No, that's very scary genetic weirdness.
One last question over there.
I'm gonna ask a really stupid question. Do you watch this anime called Psychopaths, or do you know about it?
An anime called Psychopaths.
Yeah.
No.
Psychopaths.
Psychopath.
It's about a society in Japan, of course, where they can measure people's intent to be criminals
Uh-huh.
because of this big accumulation of criminal brains that judge people based on a cymatic scan.
Wow.
Anyway, I wanted to know.
Psychopaths.
Psychopaths.
Wow. No, I haven't heard of it, but it sounds really good. I mean, so the genetic stuff, right? The one thing that I didn't talk about this time, because I haven't done enough research to really talk about it in detail, is what happens when you take very large genetic data sets and then start profiling people by their DNA. I think we've got about 10 years before that becomes a massive, urgent, screaming pressure social problem, but it might be 5.
Well, I mean, hey, sorry, that sounds like eugenics, right? Frankly, your presentation was great, but I think the first data that people gathered was census with state apparatus at the beginning of Napoleon era, right?
Mm-hmm.
And eugenics, like you're talking about, and it makes sense that this would resolve the discussion with education.
Yeah, I mean, if we get really large data sets, if 30% of people get their DNA sequenced for health reasons, and then those data sets get analyzed by enormous corporations looking for patterns in the DNA, then we're going to wind up in a world that I think is going to basically be really, really difficult. On the other hand, maybe it results in a stream of absolutely perfect people to date because we know that these genes and these genes are attracted, right?
That's an old idea.
Yeah, but we're getting the technology where those old ideas might suddenly become new ideas, and I can't even begin to imagine that world.
Thank you for bringing it back to
Interesting.
Slovenia. Do you want to give a quick response?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So part of the reason that I don't talk about labor very much is because labor is over, right? We're in the age of automation. 20 years from now, I think we'll have seen technological automation wipe out about 50% of jobs. We're in the age of permanent unemployment, and you either get a utopia or a dystopia as a result. First thing. Second thing, definitely not demonization of algorithms, but if algorithms can only be written at the cost of, say, $10 million because you need a large team in 10 years, you're only going to wind up with entities that have structural power creating new algorithms for mashing the data and extracting meaning from it. So the power analysis of who has the technical expertise to create the algorithms becomes extremely important. And right now we're failing to fund open source software development to create alternatives to things like Amazon or Uber. My hope is that blockchains will change that, but we don't know. And finally, the the subtle question about whether decentralization will produce a better world or not, I think this is cyclical, right? Decentralization has some problems, so society re-centralizes. Centralization has a bunch of problems, it becomes insufferable, then we decentralize. And I think that this is a pendulum swing, where the periodicity changes as technology basically moves society faster. Smári McCarthy and Herbert Snorrason from the Icelandic Pirate Party did a talk, Organize, Hack, Make 2013 here in the Netherlands, which was a beautiful comparison of the modern open source movement with classical anarchism. And they basically came to the conclusion that Oliver Kropotkin's work on how electrical motors would decentralize society is exactly the same as the Fab Lab argument. So the people to really chase that down in fine detail, Smári McCarthy and Herbert Snorrason, look them up online, send them a message, talk to them. You'll really enjoy their thinking. Thank you, everyone.